Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello there and welcome. At various times, this podcast has had as guests individuals who have explored the history of our community in one form or another. Based upon downloads and streams, those episodes have been very popular. More local history in this episode, the history of a business that's been part of the Kingston landscape for almost 170 years. Jim Reid is the fourth generation to own and operate James Reid Funeral Home in Kingston. 4 generations of history, entrepreneurship, and stories. Just how old is that location at 256 Princess Street? Let's find out. Here's our conversation with Jim Reid. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dave. This will be interesting.
Thanks very much for joining in. And I thought it's always interesting to read history, and it's more interesting to read about local history. But I think I'd even say it's even more interesting to hear history as told by a member of a local family who have built a business over the last 170 years here in Kingston. And I'm looking forward to this conversation and hear some of the stories as to how you built so far 4 generations worth of business here in town. The story starts with a small family planning to emigrate from County Down in Northern Ireland in a place called Kellylea, a little community. And that was back in the 1830s. And do you have any sense as to why the family decided to leave Ireland in the first place?
The Industrial Revolution was starting roughly then, and people were losing their jobs. We have a letter here from a cousin addressed to the family who had already immigrated around that time, complaining that his business of nail making in Kellylea, County Down, was being competed by a new nail-making machine that his neighbor had brought in, and how destitute he was feeling, and maybe he should join the family that has already come to Canada. Mm-hmm. So that's all I can assume, is that they heard through letters back and forth as to things were a lot rosier here than they were in Ireland.
We're talking about, I guess, the first James Reid, the gentleman whose name is on the storefront, I would gather.
Correct.
And he came over, he was a little baby at the time, as I read.
Yes, he was the youngest of 3 children.
And Mom and Dad came over.
Correct.
Now, Dad passed away on the trip over.
Yes, and was buried at sea, which, when you think about what being buried at sea means, is that you're just tossed over the side of the boat. Mm-hmm. Must have been devastating. You can imagine a young mother and 3 young children, and her husband dies at sea, and she has to arrive on the shores of Canada with 3 kids in tow.
So we have Mum and 3 kids, and they eventually land in Kingston, and Mum dies 5 years later.
Yes.
So the 3 kids were taken in by the Patterson family.
Correct.
So were they adopted, or they just lived there?
They lived there.
Okay.
They lived there. There was some connection back in Ireland that this was where they were going to come and visit, not necessarily live. And yes, they lived together, first of all, at roughly Clergy and Division, and then they moved to the Gore Road. At the very end of the Gore Road, the stone house is still there, and the Pattersons bought that and invited the Reids to live there. And that relationship obviously was nice because one of the Patterson children married James Reid's sister, Eliza. Mm-hmm. And that's how the Reids and the Pattersons are related here in Kingston.
Now, as he grew up, James decided to get married to a woman named Christiana.
Christiana, correct.
And James joined her dad's business, and he was in the upholstery business. Correct?
Almost correct. He was exposed to wood making and cabinet making because of his wife's father, who was Elijah Conklin. And but then he set up his own shop. He bought a tavern at 254 Princess Street, which is still our furniture store downtown, and set up his own little factory and made coffins and furniture.
Now, we're talking about a building, for those who may not be aware. This is right downtown Kingston, and it's on Princess Street, right opposite the intersection of Sydenham Street.
Correct.
And so that building is still there, and it's been there since 1854, at least as far as your family is concerned.
Definitely, and it even looks the same. We're designated historical, and even the colors of that building are the way they were in 1854.
Now, I had a sort of a general question about your particular industry, and that's whenever you hear of someone being in the funeral home business, there's also an affiliated furniture business.
Correct.
Do you know how far back that business of putting the two together goes back?
No, I don't know if there was a true start date, but in the late 1840s and 50s, there was everyone who was a cabinet maker built both coffins and furniture. In our case, there was 6 boys and 6 girls, and we had enough women and to align the coffins and upholster the furniture. So it was a natural marriage of 2 different unrelated careers of being in the funeral business, essentially, and the furniture business.
So at this point, they're just building the coffins. They're not conducting funerals.
No, they were held in homes and churches at the time.
So there were 6 boys, as you said, and 6 girls in this family.
Correct.
And so at some particular point, the business has to pass down to someone else, and it passes down to a gentleman named Fred.
Yes.
Why did it go to Fred?
Well, good question. You can eliminate the 6 women, because back then women didn't inherit businesses like they do today. And of the 6 boys, the eldest, Robert, in 1900, when his father, the original James, died, went off to start up his own business called Robert Reid Funeral Home, which is on Johnson at Barrie.
Okay, so that's how it's all related.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and then the other sons of James, I won't name them now, but they're either bachelors or had daughters or no kids. And in my case, the youngest of the 6 boys was Fred, as you mentioned, and he was my grandfather. He only had 1 child, who was my father.
That would be James Wilson.
Correct. So there weren't my dad didn't have a whole lot of brothers to take over the business either, so it was all my fathers upon Fred's death, and then his 2 sons, myself and my brother David, were the next successors.
Now, at this particular point, when Fred is running the business, has it changed from just building coffins?
Oh, yes. It was changing, because he was born in 1880, and we still had our manufacturing on Princess Street. But then as different factories became more efficient, both building coffins and furniture, then we would still be making furniture and coffins, but we'd be buying from these factories as well. And so the evolution to cutting back on manufacturing was a natural.
So we have the building on Princess Street, and we've now separated them so they're side by side, right? The furniture store and the funeral home are basically side by side.
Downtown, right. Prior to 1990.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the family lived 3 blocks away. I find this interesting. They lived 3 blocks away from the business, and they were big church goers, and they would go to, I think it was St. James Anglican Church, which was 3 blocks the other way, or a couple of blocks the other way. So they didn't move around much. They were right close to where the business was all the time.
True, because Kingston was much smaller, of course, and all the hub of religion, the community, everything was within a few blocks of each other.
What sort of legacy did Fred leave to the business?
Huge. In many ways, he was my hero. I worked with him for a number of summers and my early years, and I learned a lot of how you relate to the public through Fred. He never got much past grade 8, but he was very wise. I remember when I started, he said, "Now, son," even though I was his grandson, he'd call me son. "Now, son," he'd say, "when you meet a family, a grieving family, not only are you naturally nice and polite to them, but you have to be extra nice just in case you make a little boo-boo, then it's not such a big issue." Mm-hmm. And so, interesting lesson.
Now, the building, we talked a little bit about it earlier. This is the building at 254 Princess Street. Tell us about the building itself. Like, it's historical in nature, and it has not been changed dramatically since it was built in the 1800s. Describe the building for us.
Currently, it displays furniture. And at the back of the historical part, you can still see the outline of the chapel, because it was a chapel until 1990 when we closed it. And upstairs is an apartment, which was the James Reid apartment. It's hard to believe you'd have 2 adults and 12 kids in that little apartment. So that still exists. The Reids were quite entrepreneurial, because in 1910, the vaudeville theater called the Orpheum was built next door to the James Reid property you're describing. And it existed and thrived until 1922, when competition and different factors came into play, and it became available for sale. And so the Reids in 1922 bought this large theater immediately next to the old original 254. And I equate that to today, and that's a big enterprise. There's a lot of square footage in there, 2 floors, and so that was a big change for the Reids. And then the funeral home sort of expanded within its own walls into parlors. Back in those days, the visitation was mostly done in homes, but along the way, families would say, "Look, we can't even get a casket in our front door. What can you do?" So funeral homes started to build parlors, they were called in those days. And then one of the families would say, "Well, we aren't churchgoers. Can't we have the funeral here in your facility?" So funeral homes started to build nicer chapels. Mm-hmm. And these are all evolutionary moments in our history, as well as any Ontario funeral home. And then in 1973, we built where we're sitting now at 1900 John Counter, near the train station. And we ran the 2 funeral homes from 73 to 1990. And but downtown, even though the families who were loyal to downtown becoming less and less, we thought we'll just close it. And so we've been out here since 1973.
I didn't realize it was that long. Let's get back to James and his family of 12 children. Mm-hmm. You mentioned they had a small apartment on the 3rd floor. I read somewhere where the kitchen was in the basement.
Yes.
So they had to travel all the way down from the 3rd floor to the basement to have dinner.
Definitely. Yeah, the wallpaper, the coat hooks, everything are still there in the basement in the dining room.
Is there an express elevator that went from the 3rd floor to the basement?
I can just picture dear Mrs. Reid running up and down those stairs.
Now, the other thing that I found interesting as well is that at some particular point when everything was centered downtown at 254 Princess Street, that people had to walk through the furniture store to go to the funeral home area, right? If they were going to participate in a wake or something like that, correct?
Correct. That's right. It was just before my time that would actually happen. When I joined in the summers, yes, it was price tags on some of the furniture that was what we would soon have only as a funeral home, which seemed bizarre, but that's the way even in the country, that's how things operated.
That would have been interesting. So you said in 1973 you moved out here to Counter Street. The reason for the move was you just wanted to get more space?
Yes.
Make more space available to you?
Yes, you could see, even at my young age, I could see, gosh, there's no real future here downtown. There's constricted, there's no parking, the facilities are small, you can't really improve them. So we bought out here. It was a vacant field. Counter Street wasn't really even here quite yet. It was just sort of a laneway out there, cut through Mr. Tickert's property. And so we bought our share, and Mr. Tickert still owned across the way, which is now Marshall's Sand and Gravel over there.
So You moved out here, you put the funeral home here, but you also put a furniture store here as well, which is a separate building.
Correct. Next door is, in 1979, we built James Reid Furniture next to the funeral home here, which we built in 1973.
Now, we're going to skip over your dad for half a second here. I'm just curious to know. So, way back at the very beginning, the Reid family ran both the furniture store as well as the funeral home.
Correct.
So, these days, do you still run the furniture store, or do you have other folks who run it for you?
As I mentioned earlier, my brother David and I run James Reid Limited, which has the two divisions, furniture and funeral. And David looks after the furniture, two stores, and I'm funeral. That's the current situation until maybe 5 years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I was still very active in the furniture stores. So I wore two hats, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go back and talk about your dad, who took over the business from Fred. And I have a note here that said at one particular point, the name seemed to go from undertaker to funeral man because of friends on Wolf Island.
Okay, my dad wrote a nice story. He was quite a writer. He'd take a topic and just go with it, and he was a good writer. And he wrote a nice story about my grandfather, his father, called The Funeral Man. So, and yes, we used to do a lot of funerals on Wolf Island. We even had a barn over there that, actually Mr. Hogan's barn, where we'd store caskets, so the family didn't really have to come to Kingston to select a casket. In those days, we had mobile embalming equipment that you could take to the island and embalm the body there. So for the family's convenience, everything was done on the island.
Now, there were some aspects of your dad that I've noticed when I was reading through some of the research I was doing, and his driving abilities were highlighted in one of those paragraphs where I think you're supposed to drive, or you were supposed to drive the hearse at, 10 miles an hour?
Well, something like that. We're talking about Fred now, right? My grandfather?
No, we're talking about James. Or is Fred, were the two of them the same?
Well, Fred was the one, if this story's going to how slow he drove, that would be my grandfather.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was your dad a little rough with the driving and sometimes would hit vehicles as he was driving along?
That was my grandfather.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I'm attributing something, to the wrong person.
Yeah.
You mentioned, what is it called, a Henny?
That's the hearse.
Okay.
That was
That's the brand name of the
brand
vehicle?
name,
Okay.
yes.
I was not aware of that. Okay. Now, was it your dad that liked to sing at the front door?
That was my grandfather.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, he had a hearing aid, and he was always humming, even at funerals. And as a young guy, I was trying to make sure everything was going extra correctly. And I say, "Gramps, you're humming." "Oh yes, yes, son, yes, son." And some great hearing aid stories. I always remember family telling me just prior to the service, "Gramps, we're ready to have the casket closed now." So I went up to my grandfather and said, "Family are ready to have the casket closed now." And he didn't hear me, and I had to say it louder and louder. And anyways, it was just one of those awkward moments for a young guy to be passing on a message to his grandfather.
Now, what sort of things did your dad make? What sort of contributions did he make to the business?
Oh, big time. He was quite entrepreneurial. It was his idea to start the furniture store next door in 79. And I don't want to attribute too much to myself, but I think because he had a son who was very active in the business, even though I was not even in university yet, he said, let's talk about moving away from Princess Street as a funeral home. And he and I would go around different properties. Some were downtown Kingston, which in hindsight was such a good move not to buy. In the old days, funeral homes just bought up an old large residence and then built on a chapel, and that would be the funeral home. No sense of parking back in those days.
Right.
And I can still picture some of the vacant land that we looked at that we didn't buy. And so he and I were good business partners.
Now, did you always want to be in this business?
Well, that's an interesting question. Over the summers, I thought, am I truly in love with this business, or is it just because Dad says, "Come down and cut the grass, son," This is when I was quite young. And so as the summers went along and working with my grandfather and different staff who all had real motivation and beautiful personalities and everything, I thought, well, this is a pretty nice career. Just It's sad that you're dealing with grief all the time, but I could see even back then that if you conducted a really good funeral for them, it was a proper way to let them say goodbye. And when you get a thank you from a grieving family, it makes you feel very good. And I could see that had a lot of value. I don't mean financial value, but just in any career, it's important to know that you're doing a good job in especially a sensitive career like funeral service.
And you've got to like what you're doing.
Oh,
Yeah.
I still do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I still do.
So at some particular point, you will retire, and your daughter's going to take over. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is Sarah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there were no boys, or is this because we're in the 21st century here?
I have a son, Jim,
Yeah.
who is a lawyer in Toronto, and we all get along wonderfully. But he chose the law. He didn't really not choose James Reid's. It's just that law was a stronger passion for him. And but I'm lucky that Sarah came along and loves funeral service. I was assumed as a young father that the roles would be traditional. If my kids came into the business, Sarah would like furniture because it's fashion, it's fabrics, it's textures. And the men in the family, my son, would join the funeral home. But luckily, Sarah loves funeral service.
Now, you mentioned about getting involved with the community by virtue of being available to the families when they need you the most. Every businessman does tend to have some sort of involvement with the community indirectly through activities that he or she does outside work. So you've been involved with the military, at least one particular regiment, for a while, I gather.
Yes, the 21 Electronic Warfare Regiment. I've just retired from being the honorary colonel there, 13 years. So that's truly an honor. Usually the postings are for 2 or 3 years, but when my 2 or 3 year terms were up, the commanding officer would literally very casually say, "Do you want to carry on, Jim?" And I'd say yes, and that would be it. And so after just continued on for 13 years of being very active as an honorary colonel at the base.
Is this something you chose, or did they come to you and ask you to be an honorary colonel?
They came to me.
Okay.
It's an interesting story. Who came to me was by way of the Rotary Club, because the military knew someone in our Rotary Club, but they didn't know me. So they went to this chap, and he got the description a little wrong because he wasn't in the military. And he said, "Jim, here's the phone number. Please phone it. This guy wants to know if you're interested in being the honorary commandant of the base." And I thought, I've never heard of that term, but anyway, so I phoned up, and it was turned out to be not a commandant, of course, but the honorary colonel. And I started off as the honorary lieutenant colonel, and then midway through, when the squadrons became amalgamated into a new regiment, I was promoted to be the honorary colonel of the new regiment.
Now, does the colonel have to get trained to be in that particular position?
There's an aide memoir that is a broad guideline, and if you follow it and ask lots of questions, that would be the training. It's not training as such. I used to go over Thursday evenings and sit in on some of the classes, and I found that helpful in my training, even how to do up boots. Like something is the protocol of just the dress code, because it's 3 different uniforms essentially, and you have to wear each one properly. They're all legal uniforms, and no one really come up and said, "Now, Jim, here's how you do it," but you learn quickly.
There are a couple of stories that I read on the website that are quite humorous, and even though it's a sad time for a lot of people, there still are humorous aspects that do crop up from time to time. And I have this vision of a funeral procession driving to the cemetery, and then somebody missing the turn and having to drive down, and everybody had to make a U-turn. Is that reasonably accurate?
It's a story that is true in Kingston, but it wasn't our funeral home.
Oh, okay.
Yes. They missed the turn, and there's two stories, something like that. They missed the turn and came back, finally finding the location of the grave. But my story, I can tell it accurately because it happened to me. Pulled into the cemetery, and the cemetery always had names of the funeral homes posted so we could follow the arrows around the cemetery. It's a beautiful big cemetery, and every lead car funeral director is so afraid of getting lost in this big cemetery, Cataraqui Cemetery. So I pull in, and there's no James Reid signs. There's a competitor's sign though, and I thought, that's no help to me. And I thought, what am I going to do? But then I had this memory of going to this family grave years ago, and it's the same family. So on a long shot, because when you got a moving procession behind you, you can't get out and ask the family behind you, do I turn left or right here?
Yeah.
So just by pure luck, I knew where, I'll call it Smith, where As Smith grave was. And sure enough, it was fine. So I went back to the cemetery office later to complain. I said, not only you put up the wrong signs, it could have been very embarrassing. So the secretary, who I knew, said, "Oh, Jim, I'm so sorry. We apologize. We let Harold put out the signs." I said, "Well, what are you telling me? That's not an excuse. It's not even an explanation." "Well, Harold doesn't read." So you can imagine. And we both broke into great laughters, and that was the end of my complaint. So,
the other story that I liked too was about the parrot. Now, was that your family?
That was my family. My dad used to tell that story.
But it wasn't your dad who was involved, or was it? This was the parrot that belonged to the woman who had passed away. She lived alone with the parrot.
Right.
And they had the service in her house, and the parrot was still alive.
Right.
And he was off on his own in the kitchen until somebody opened the door. And he would go into his repertoire of words that he had memorized, a couple of which were not polite words, but unfortunately they came out during the middle of the service.
Right. Well, that's accurate.
You mentioned before that your daughter is going to, at some particular point, take over when you decide that it's time to retire. And how do you see the business evolving moving forward into the next number of years?
Well, good question. Even presently, especially with the pandemic, the cremation rate has gone from what was about 70% to maybe 75% just prior to the pandemic, and now we're at 90% cremation. So that has changed a lot of the traditions in funeral service. There was, especially with the pandemic, by law, we in Ontario, funeral homes could not have public visitations. There was quite a while where we were restricted to 10 people in the funeral home. Mm-hmm. That's 9 people in the chapel plus the minister is 10. And so families switched to just having dear mum or grandmom cremated.
Right.
And that just might stay that way, that 90% cremation. So that's a huge evolution. The other is we have a large part of our building called the Celebration Center, where it's more like a reception with food and coffee. And if during the reception, just during the celebration, someone wants to say something, there's a microphone, and it's similar to a wedding reception, that there's a pause, and one of the family members will say something nice, not a formal eulogy, but just a few nice words about the deceased. Mm-hmm. And then that's it for the audio part of the service. Then you're back to visiting with all your extended family. So that's basically what a celebration is. And so to answer your question, what's the evolution of funeral service? We just might, because we have space out back, even build a bigger celebration center. But that would involve more parking, and we're into the Cataraqui Conservation Area. They have a lot of restrictions, of course.
Right.
So that's another big evolution, is we become event planners more than funeral directors.
Mm-hmm. The other question is, Yours is a family operation. Like a lot of other industries, there are big companies all over the country and all over North America that are swooping in and picking up businesses and buying them and creating large conglomerates. And that doesn't just apply to your business, it applies to a lot of businesses. Where do you see that going with respect to the funeral home business? Do you see more of that happening?
Yes, and they aren't even huge conglomerates. They sometimes very entrepreneurial. Smaller town funeral home can buy up the local countryside funeral homes, which has happened just an hour away from here. But you're referring to big companies like Arbor or SCI, which is Service Corporation International. They own a lot of Ontario funeral homes. And it's been a long time since I was approached, but maybe 30 years ago, one of the conglomerates used to take me out for breakfast, just trying to see if I was interested in selling. And I always said yes to the breakfast meeting because I love a big breakfast, and plus I figured I would learn more than he would. And even though I was up front with him each time, I said, "Look, it's not for sale, but well, we understand that, Mr. Reid, but come on out." And so sure. So I learned a lot about how they assess a funeral home, which was interesting. And so even in Kingston, Kingston has 5 funeral homes, and 3 of them are owned by one out-of-town corporation. So they have the efficiency of moving staff around and vehicles around, but families that really want the personal touch, this is what we hear all the time. It's just more like home in here, they say.
Yeah, that happens with a lot of businesses, is the personal touch. Well, I'm going to say that we certainly do appreciate the service that you do provide to the community, and we do appreciate the time you have given us today, and I thank you for that, and all the best going forward.
Thank you, Dave.
Our thanks once again to Jim Reid, owner and operator of James Reid Funeral Home in Kingston. This episode was recorded in March 2022.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.